Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for the spring edition of the South Hampstead Speakers Series. I don't think we could have chosen a better week to have a politician in to speak to us. I'm sure we are, is enjoying the word? I'm not sure, but the lockdown files. But Gavin, I suspect you may get some questions about standards in public life. But I'm really delighted to welcome the Right Honourable Lord Barwell, who has spent his life so far in politics. He was Chief Operating Officer for the Conservative Party. He was an MP for Croydon for 7, I believe, quite happy and fulfilled years. He lost his seat in the 2017 election, and I think he thought he might spend a bit more time with his family, but very shortly afterwards he was invited to be Theresa May's Chief of Staff. And he's written a book which I am currently devouring about his time as Theresa May's Chief of Staff during one of the most turbulent recent periods in British political history. Now, Gavin assured me when we spoke last week that there were no-go areas for questions. And he's particularly keen to hear from young people in the audience. So I'm going to ask Gavin to tell us a bit about his life as a politician and about his time in various roles. And then I'm going to throw open the floor to questions. So be prepared, be courageous. So Gavin, could you start by telling us about how you decided to enter the political arena and why you became a Conservative?
So I got into it completely by accident, really. I'd always been interested in politics growing up for reasons I'll come back, which answers your second bit of your question, but I'll come back to that. But I studied science, I never studied politics. I studied my degrees in theoretical physics. And at the end of that, I knew that I probably wasn't cut out to be a theoretical physicist, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And the guy that I was sharing a room with at university was worried I wasn't going to have a job. So he went to the University Careers Library and came back with 100 random job adverts. And I wasn't very keen on many of them. And there was one that was advising the Conservative Party on environmental policy, so it had a bit of a scientific connection. And I didn't immediately reject it. So he sort of said, well, that's the only one you haven't rejected out of hand. You've got to apply for it. And they offered me a job. And then when I got there, I loved it. So it was really his fault, is what I'm basically saying. But got into it completely by accident. In terms of why I'm a Conservative, I mean, the honest answer is it goes back to a particular incident when I was really quite young. And I think if you talk to a lot of politicians, you'll find the same. So I had lymphatic cancer when I was 8 or 9 years old. And in order to get, at that time, there were a lot of strikes going on in the NHS, and there were sort of picket lines outside the hospitals, and the doctor had to come and escort you through the picket line for the radiotherapy treatment that I was having. And I suppose, abnormally, at that young age, I didn't understand why these people were trying to stop us getting into the hospital, and that sort of sparked my interest in it, I guess. So it's a strange, obviously that's a weird thing to happen to an 8 or 9-year-old, but that's probably the sort of starting point of it, I would say. So
you'd sort of been in, I suppose, had, sort of that experience when you were young, sort of, I suppose, explains why you became a Conservative. But were you political at university? Or, I mean, it sounds as if it was just your friend's suggestion that meant you ended up.
So I was always interested in it, but I wasn't a member of I wasn't a member of the University Conservative Association. I don't want to paint too much of a picture of myself as a nerd, but I was into debating.
Okay.
So
we're very into debating.
So that, I suppose, that was the sort of manifestation of the interest in politics. But my best friend from home, who's a lifelong Labour activist, we had this sort of, as we were growing up together, we had this shared passion. We used to argue all the time about it. So I'd always been interested in it, but never studied it, never thought it was something I was going to do as a job.
So I suppose the strength of a debater is to see both sides of the argument. But yet you've been a lifelong Conservative. Have you ever had any doubts about your political affiliations?
In recent years, certainly. So I'm not, I'm still a member of the party because I think, I guess people in this audience will have different views, but I think when your party is led by someone that you don't agree with, the easy thing to do is walk away. But if all the moderate people had left Labour when Jeremy Corbyn was in control, they would never have got the Labour Party back. So I think it's always a very difficult situation when you feel you're not comfortable with the direction of a party, but you still feel, well, I haven't changed what I believe. So I think probably the answer to your question is that I've never thought I'm not a Conservative, but I've definitely had periods where I'm not comfortable with what the current leadership of the Conservative Party is saying. Just to pick up on your debating point, because I think that is a really good point, one of the things I always say when people come to me for advice about getting involved in politics, people often think that being good at public speaking is the key skill. And I actually think being good at listening is the key skill. You know, the skill of debating isn't, obviously you have to be able to get up and make your argument, but the real skill is to listen to what the other person is saying and work out where the strengths and weaknesses are in what they're saying. And our politics would be in a healthier state if our politicians spent more time listening to what the other side have to say and working out, okay, well, I disagree with that, but maybe they have a bit of a point on this, and maybe we should reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah. I think society would probably be in a better state if we listened to each other more. I want to come back to your physics, not just because if you ever decided that a career in teaching was your thing, schools are always looking for physics teachers, but you studied natural sciences at Cambridge, and there's been talk in the past, hasn't there, about how we're ruled by a bunch of PPEists, and there are people in this room I know will have studied philosophy, politics and economics. It's a noble subject, but do you think we would be better off if we had more scientists in government? What do you think it would give us?
I think more numeracy and more scientific literacy would definitely be a major asset, not just in government but in Parliament. So it's not just an issue for politicians, it's also an issue for our civil service, because if you looked at the sort of degree backgrounds of many of our senior civil servants, they would be lawyers or PPE or those kinds of subjects, essentially. So, if you think about the world that the students that are here tonight are growing up in, the pace of technological change is speeding up all the time. And we are behind the curve in so many areas in terms of regulating those technologies. You think about social media, which is now, I expect nearly everybody in this room is using one or more social media platforms. We never really understood what that technology was before widespread adoption. And the algorithms that sit behind it have led to a significant coarsening of our national debate. The reality is that most of us now live in little bubbles where we listen to the opinions of people that we find agreeable. We've stopped talking to each other, and we've allowed a whole load of people to comment anonymously. And I'm afraid it's a sad fact about lots of human beings that when you know who it is that's talking to you, they'll be very careful about what they say. But when they think they can say something anonymously, they'll behave in a completely different way. So that's social media. But you think about gene editing, or you think about AI and the potential those technologies have, both in a good way transformatively, but also some of the risk that applies to them. So it's so important that we have good scientific literacy among our officials, our regulators, but also our politicians, so that they understand these emerging technologies and the implications they're going to have for public policy.
So how could we encourage more of that sort of person to go into, with that sort of scientific thinking, somebody who's prepared to do the hard work on acquiring knowledge and going through policy development? How can we encourage that sort of person to go into politics? Because I can see why it wouldn't seem like a very attractive career for someone very methodical and diligent at the moment with the way some politicians are behaving.
So I think we've got two issues. One is a general attractiveness of politics at the moment. I mean, it's become a less attractive thing for people to do, and we need to address that. Otherwise, we're going to pay a heavy price if talented people are put off from getting involved in public life. So maybe we come back to that or park that. It would be good for more people from a scientific background to come into politics, but that isn't going to be the sole answer to the problem. Because, there are, as you said, there are other subjects that are valid and important and make an important contribution. So I think one of the things we need to think about is how do we train our officials in politics, how do we give them access to a basic scientific literacy, even if they haven't studied that subject at degree level, so that they're able to take informed decisions.
Maybe Rishi Sunak's idea for everyone to study maths until they leave school isn't such a bad idea.
So I basically agree with where he's coming from, right? So I definitely think if you think about the future and the growth potential of our economy, we need more people with good mathematical skills. Whether that means everybody has to study the subject up to 18. I mean, you'll know as a head teacher, there are some pupils whose aptitude is not in those areas, and I would argue if you've got them up to a basic level of numeracy so that they can function effectively in life? Is it necessarily in their interest to make them all study up to 18? I don't know. So I can see what he's trying to do is overall raise the standards, and I agree with that. I'm not sure if this particular policy is the way I would do it.
So I'd like to go back to your time as an MP at Gavin. So you were MP for Croydon between 2010 and 2017. And from talking to you, it seemed like you really enjoyed that time in your life, and something that Theresa May, I think, also enjoyed. She loved being an MP. What was it about that job that you loved so much?
So the first thing, which I personally think is really important, is that I represented the place I'm from. You know, I've lived in Croydon since I was a few months old, so I have no memory of living anywhere else. I was representing the place I grew up. And actually, you know, the result, when I got elected as the MP, it was in my old school that the count took place. So I felt that was really important, because I think there are some MPs who are effectively hired lobbyists. You know, they've come from somewhere else to be the MP, but they don't have a connection with that place. Whereas to me, every day I was going into work, I was going there to fight for the place that I'm from. And Croydon is, you know, it's got a lot going for it, but it's got some challenges as well. As most of you probably, those of you who haven't been there, have probably got a view of Croydon from the media. So I was very passionate about that side of the job. And there is a second bit of it as well, which I found very rewarding, which is that MPs have surgeries, much like GPs, where people come to you for help with problems. And a lot of it is routine. You know, you have people that have got a problem with their immigration status or their benefit claim, or they're trying to get their kid into a particular local school or whatever. But occasionally, someone will come along who something wrong has happened and exposes an injustice in the system. And so the example from my time as an MP that will always sit with me, I was in the back room of a cold church hall. And this family came in, husband and wife, the wife's sister, husband's brother. And it took an hour and a half that their daughter had been killed outside their house by a driver under the influence of illegal drugs, run down outside their house. And the guy had been sentenced in jail for 4 months and served 2 months and released. And he lived locally. So he's walking around outside their house, the person who did this. And this incredibly brave family wanted something positive to come out of this terrible tragedy. They wanted the law changed so that drug driving is treated as seriously as drink driving. And they basically said, we want you to help us. And you know, it took a year and a half. We took them in to see David Cameron, and eventually we got a piece of government legislation amended to include, they referred to it as Lillian's Law after their daughter, to put drug driving on a similar footing to drink driving. And so that kind of work, I think, is really rewarding. You know, the credit really belongs to them, not to me, but I did a little bit to help them achieve what they were trying to achieve.
I mean, MPs must see so many stories of, you know, constituents who are really, really struggling. I imagine that's particularly the case at the moment. And, you know, for every person they're able to help, there must be dozens they can't necessarily do anything before. I mean, how do you cope with that when you've gone into politics to try and help people? It's
very difficult. You know, and you have people that come to your surgery who, you know, are suicidal sometimes because of the complexity of the problems that they're facing. And you try and do everything you can. You try and direct them to the help that is available and the services that they need, but often there isn't a perfect answer. So it's that part of the job, you know, it can be very rewarding. It can also be very upsetting and distressing and draining. But that's your job. You're there to try and help people as best you can. And it's, you know, it's a complete, most people think of sitting on the green benches and taking part in the debates on legislation. And of course, that's an important part of the job too, but there is a whole another side to it that doesn't get the same attention.
So if we fast forward a minute to June 2017, which didn't go anything like as well as the Conservative Party would have hoped, and you were one of the many Conservative MPs that night who lost their seat. I imagine you must have been quite angry with Mrs May, and yet you ended up becoming her right-hand man as Chief of Staff. So tell us about that episode and how you became her Chief of Staff and why you think she chose you.
So, I mean, for those who don't know, so elections take place on a Thursday. So you get until 10 p.m. to vote, and then the count takes place Thursday night, Friday morning. So I think my result got declared about 6 in the morning on Friday. And at that point, you've been up for over 24 hours. You spent most of the previous day pounding the streets, so you're pretty tired. And obviously, I wasn't particularly cheery either. So you go home, get some sleep. I woke up, I think, sort of mid-afternoon on the Friday. And my phone, there were like hundreds of text messages, which were a roughly even split between friends saying really sorry and journalists saying, would you like to come on our programme and tell us what you think of Theresa May? And I thought, well, I'll do 2 interviews tomorrow morning when I've had a bit more sleep, and then that's me done with politics, and I'll think about what I'm going to do next in my life. So I did, I think it was BBC Breakfast News and the Today programme, and then I came out, I went into BBC Broadcasting House on Regent Street to do it. Came out, and it was a lovely June morning. London was looking beautiful. And I thought, well, I'll walk back to Victoria and just have a think about what I want to do with my life. And I'd got about 4 or 5 minutes down the road when a message came through on the phone from something called Switch, which is the Downing Street switchboard. It's this amazing institution, as I was subsequently to find out, where they'll get anyone anywhere in the world. In fact, if I just take a little aside from this story, one person once phoned up number 10 wanting to speak to me, but instead of saying Gavin Barwell, they said Gary Barlow. And the number 10 switchboard in 10 minutes tracked down Gary Barlow on the beach of a Caribbean island.
That's impressive.
And put the call through to me. But anyway, back to the story, the sad story I was telling, or sad if you're a Conservative anyway. So I just said the Prime Minister wants to talk to you.
And did you know her particularly well at that stage?
I mean, I knew her, but not well.
Okay.
I'd served as an MP with her, but no, I didn't know her well. So I thought, well, she's probably phoning round the 30-odd MPs who've lost their seats to say sorry. So I phoned up, and that's how the conversation started. And then I can't remember exactly what she said, but it was something like, anyway, I'm in a bit of a hole. And I remember thinking, you're in a hole, I've just lost my bloody job. And then she said, and I'd like you to come in and be my Chief of Staff. And it was one of those, I'm sure you've all had these kind of experiences where someone says something to you in a conversation and you almost like can't believe they just said that thing. So I didn't immediately respond. And whoever I don't know who suggested me, but whoever it was had obviously said to her, he's got young kids, he might not want to do it. So she sort of very quickly said, like, if you don't want to do it, then I understand. And I was like, no, I do want to do it. I need to talk to my wife.
You didn't even have to think about it.
No, yeah, I knew I wanted to do it, but I like, somebody made a very good joke about this afterwards, but when you lose, when you have the election result, the winning MP goes up first and gives a sort of, thank you everyone for voting for me, and then the loser has to go up and say, thank you to their people who supported them. And so I didn't speak for very long, but I ended what I was saying by saying, if there's any silver lining to this, it's that my wife and my children are going to get to see a bit more of me now. And that remark was in my mind when I then had to phone my wife up. And my wife had been really worried that I wouldn't get a job. So the way I handled it, I sort of phoned her up and said, well, I've got some good news and some bad news. And she said, okay, what's the good news? I said, well, I found another job. And she went, oh, God. I said, the bad news is what it is. But I think she could see that it was an amazing opportunity, so she very kindly consented to me doing it. But yeah, so it was just this bizarre 24 hours where you go from losing. I had 2 jobs that I loved as the MP for Croydon and as housing minister, and you lose both of those jobs at a stroke.
It does sort of highlight that thing in politics where people get parachuted into jobs where they have no idea about what the brief is, and suddenly they're justice minister or their environment secretary. I mean, you hadn't been a chief of staff before, but so I mean that must have been a really, really steep learning curve.
Yeah. I didn't really know. I mean, I remember asking her, is there a job description? And she just sort of smiled at me. Yeah. And the other thing about it, which maybe isn't so obvious, is you have to know the Prime Minister, your Chief of Staff, to incredibly well, because basically the main function of being Chief of Staff is you're like the Oracle of Delphi, right? A whole bunch of people want to know what the Prime Minister thinks, but they're too polite to phone the Prime Minister up, so they just phone you. So if you're in the office, a queue of people would form at my desk of senior civil servants and ministers wanting to ask me something, and if I wasn't in the office, my phone would just ring constantly with people wanting to know or sometimes the Prime Minister's press secretary saying, I've got journalists asking me what the Prime Minister thinks about this. What does she think? So you had to know the Prime Minister's mind. And as I said, I didn't know her that well. And you probably are all very well aware she's quite a private person. She's not an easy person to get to know. So when we were having this conversation, she sort of said to me, well, I'll see you Monday morning. And I was like, no, I need to come see you right now. Where are you? Are you in Downing Street? And she was like, no, I'm at home. And I was like, okay, how do I get there? And she was sort of slightly taken aback and said, well, get on the train to Reading and Philip will come and pick you up. So I was right, okay. So I'm sitting on this train, my life having taken a fairly dramatic turn, thinking, how am I going to get this notoriously private person to open up and in the next 3 or 4 hours get to know everything I need to know? And I came up with what, in hindsight, is a completely reckless idea, which is I made a list of 3 things about Theresa May I really admired and 3 things where I thought she'd done something really stupid. And I thought I'll use these as an icebreaker to get her to talk. And so I sort of said this to her, and her eyes narrowed in what I now know is a characteristic Theresa May gesture. And she said, well, we better start with the things where you thought I was stupid. So we went into this list of 3, but it did work.
And what was the thing? Did she take offence at any of the things you raised?
No, she didn't take offence. So one of them turned out to be easy because it was something I didn't know this and you wouldn't know, but it was something a deputy of hers had done that she didn't really agree with, and she'd taken the blame for it, but she'd actually squashed it. But the other 2 were things where she thought what she'd done was right, and we had a proper sort of robust conversation about them. And then we did the 3 that I agreed. And then we got into the really key question, which was, why did she think the election had gone so badly wrong? Because that was the thing that really worried me, that if I had a very strong view of what had gone wrong, but if she had a different view to me about what had gone wrong, then that's quite difficult at that point. But actually, she had the same view as me.
So obviously quite a few things then went wrong in the subsequent 2 years. And you say in the opening of your book that you felt that you had failed as her chief of staff because you saw your one job as keeping the Prime Minister in office, and obviously that didn't happen. I mean, it's an incredibly complex question. We're still seeing it play out now. But what do you think the biggest mistakes were that she made during the Brexit negotiations?
I'm not sure if the big mistakes were in the Brexit negotiation. I think the big mistake was the way she conducted the 2017 election.
Okay.
Right. So I think I'm safe saying this now because it's so long ago. So if she were here, this is the problem that she had. Right. She inherited from David Cameron a fairly small majority, and she knew that whatever Brexit deal she negotiated, it would either be too soft for some of the hardliners in the Conservative Party, or it would be too hard for some of the pro-Europeans. So she knew she wouldn't be able to get any deal through with that smaller majority, so she had to get a bigger majority. But she couldn't very well come in front of all of you and say, look, I've called this election, and the reason is these people are really unreliable. And so I need you to give me a bigger majority because these people are basically crazy and they won't compromise on this stuff. So instead, you got this whole strong and stable and this whole confected thing, which wasn't the real reason she was calling the election. And the thing about her that I learned is if you take David Cameron, you could say to David Cameron, come in here tonight and convince these good people that the moon is made of blue cheese. And he would make a pretty good go at it. He's a salesperson. Tony Blair the same. All right? They can sell. And it doesn't really matter whether they really believe in the thing they're selling or whether they've decided that tactically that's the right place to go. They can sell convincingly. Theresa can't do that. If she believes in something, she can be a very good communicator. But the 2017 election showed that when she was uncomfortable with what a bunch of advisors had told her she needed to say, she came across completely wooden. I think people called her a robot, didn't they? So that was the big mistake. If she'd fought the election she wanted to fight, then I think all the evidence is she would have won quite big. And if she'd had a big majority, she could have got the deal through. And she would actually have had more leverage with the EU as well. One of the reasons she struggled in the negotiations is the EU never thought she was going to get the deal through. So they didn't want to give her that last compromise because they thought, well, it's probably not going to work and we'll probably need to keep that back for the next person that comes along. So to me, the big mistake is the way she ran the 2017 election.
Do you think she maybe shouldn't have called it in the first place?
No, I think she was right to call it, because she wouldn't have got a deal through with that small majority. It's just she messed up, and she would. I'm not telling you something she doesn't think. This was the thing I wanted to hear when I went down there. That if she thought it was all very unfair and the public had sort of treated her unfairly, then it's really difficult. But if you basically recognise you've messed up, then it becomes much easier about what you do going forward from there, basically.
And I think you say as well that about sort of 95% of the deal we then eventually struck was Theresa May's deal, and about 5% was Boris Johnson. Do you think we're starting to see her legacy differently after all the turmoil that we've had in the last few years? I mean, what would you say her achievements were? And be interesting to ask.
Yeah, I mean, it's the question almost for the audience.
Yeah.
So the two big differences, I don't want to bore people with all the technicalities of Brexit, but the two big differences between her deal and Boris Johnson's deal, one relates to Northern Ireland. She didn't want any border down the Irish Sea because she thought it would endanger the Good Friday Agreement. He agreed to a border down the Irish Sea, and it has endangered the Good Friday Agreement. And Rishi Sunak is now trying to sort out that mess, essentially. And the other difference was that she was prepared, however you want to describe it, she was prepared to limit to a degree the freedoms we had when we left in order to avoid friction at the UK-EU border for trade, because she believed that friction would be very damaging to our economy. And I would argue the evidence is pretty clear, it's been very damaging to our economy. So on both those points, I think she's been vindicated. One of them is now being repaired by Sunak. And, you know, we were talking privately beforehand, but the thing that really interests me, if you read Labour's 5-point plan to sort out the Brexit deal, it's basically turning it back into Theresa May's deal pretty much. So, you know, I think we're going to end up in that kind of relationship. If we don't end up, we may end up going back even closer now, because if you look at the polls, the public have, increasing numbers of the public think we made a mistake. But I think those two key judgments she made have been vindicated by events.
Yeah. So, I mean, you describe her in your book as the most private of prime ministers, and I think it's true. I hope it's not a political statement to say that she came across as quite rigid. I think we all enjoyed the dancing scenes at Conservative Party conference. In fact, I even showed clips of Theresa May dancing in school assemblies. But you worked very closely with her over the course of 2 years. I mean, did you admire some of her achievements? How much did you actually get to know her as a person? And do you think she was misunderstood at the time?
So you obviously get to know someone very well, because I was spending virtually every waking hour of my life with her. I mean, there was a moment very early on which was slightly surreal, where when the Prime Minister goes on a long distance trip, there's an RAF plane that takes her called a Voyager, and so you're in the front of what would be first class, and I would sit there, she would sit here, and there was a kind of briefing table in front of us, and the seats kind of fold back into a bed. So at one point she's kind of folded back and is asleep, and I was like, okay, this is a bit awkward. Do I stay sitting up, or do I just sort of lie the other way? So you get to know them quite well, I think is the summation of that. And yeah, I hugely admire her as a person. I think she's not, I mean, the first thing I'd say to everybody in the audience, that there is no such thing as a perfect politician. So whoever you get, they're going to have strengths and weaknesses. And the thing that she struggled with, and I think she would admit this herself, is the sort of communication side of the job. Particularly if she was being interviewed by like Andrew Marr or something like this, she was very defensive, and so she came across it, but rigid was the word you used, right? But the three things that I saw were, one, you know, an incredible work ethic. She worked so hard at it, and she was across all of the detail in all of the meetings in a way, if you talk to any of the EU leaders, they didn't always agree with what the UK had done or the position she was taking, but they all respected her. And her kind of tenacity and her mastery of the detail of what she was talking about. And secondly, she's got a very strong commitment to what I would call proper public service. And this is the thing that I think distinguishes her from the person that came after her. That she did what she thought was right for the country. And there'll be plenty of people in this room that didn't agree with her. Sometimes I didn't agree with her. But I never, ever sat there thinking she's doing something that is convenient for her, but not what she actually thinks is right. She always pursued what she thought was the right answer for the country. And that, I think, was hugely admirable. And then she also was very passionate about the constituency part of the job. And that's why she stayed in. All the other recent prime ministers have kind of disappeared off once they've stopped being prime minister. She's still there.
She still
in
says hello
because
to that same dog every Sunday, doesn't she? So can we talk about some politicians who are less than perfect, and look at the last 3 years? And I suppose an interesting thought, and maybe this isn't my question, Gavin, but would Theresa May have handled the pandemic better? But there have been some stories about which the general public has been, I think quite rightly, really furious. Partygate, Barnard Castle, questionable tax arrangements for not one but two chancellors of the Exchequer, affairs in Matt Hancock's case that breached social distancing guidelines. Brilliant reading his defence of those in the lockdown files this weekend. And it can sometimes feel as if sleaze is back in politics. And I remember I came of age just before Tony Blair swept to power in 1997, and there was all this talk about sleaze in the late years of the Conservative Party. Do you think we've re-entered a period of sleaze and lack of trust in politics?
So we've definitely got a problem with lack of trust. I don't like the term because I don't like, having been an MP, maybe I'm too defensive, but I don't like generalising across a whole group of people, because I think there are plenty of MPs on both sides who are good people, who are in Parliament for the right reasons. And if you start talking about the whole system, you kind of tar everybody with that brush. So if we take basically two individuals you've talked about there, and I would draw a distinction. So, I know them both very well. So I think with Matt, he did something wrong, but he recognised that he did something wrong and he resigned.
It took him a little while.
It took him a little while, right? And it takes politicians a little while sometimes to recognise these things. And I don't... It's very difficult for me to answer these questions, right? Because he's someone I know well, and I spoke to him during those few days, and I don't want to divulge private conversations. But he ultimately got himself to the right point, which was to understand why people were very angry about what he'd done, and to recognise that the only decent thing to do in that situation was to resign. I think with Boris Johnson, I often think about if you'd had to do this job for him. I mean, second only to being Chief of Staff to Donald Trump in nightmare jobs in politics. But the tragedy of Boris Johnson is, he is an incredibly able political communicator. He'd won this huge majority. He had he had the opportunity potentially to be Prime Minister for 10 years and deliver transformational change of the country. And the reason he's not Prime Minister anymore isn't because all of you have completely fallen out with him over a policy issue like with Thatcher over poll tax or Blair over Iraq. It's just because of the way he's behaved. I mean, all these Tory MPs whinging about an establishment plot that brought down Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson brought down Boris Johnson. Right? It's all his own doing. And it comes down to, somebody asked me a question once, which I think is sort of indicative of this, which is imagine you have been his Chief of Staff and this Partygate story, the first day the Partygate story came out, which was, I think, October, November of, lost all track of time, 2021, I think it was. And to me, the answer at that moment was obvious, which is find out the facts. Whenever a political scandal breaks, find out the facts. What actually went on here? And if the facts tell you that actually a whole bunch of events went on in Downing Street that were clearly contrary to what the COVID restrictions said, a few of which the Prime Minister was at, lots of which he was not at, then there's only one course of action, which is to go to the House of Commons, tell the truth about it, and apologise.
And resign?
Well, maybe resign. That's a judgment for the individual politician. But I guarantee to you that I want you to imagine a counterfactual world where he went to the House of Commons and said, because the original story was just about one event. At that point, we didn't know there had been lots. Imagine if he'd come to the House of Commons and said, I've gone back and I've looked into this and I've checked. And actually, there were a number of these events that took place, a couple of which I was at, a number of which I had nothing to do with at all. At the time, talking to people, we all felt that we were kind of in one bubble together. You were all at home, and we had to carry on working in an office together. So we kind of developed this mentality that we were in a bubble together. But actually, looking back at it from this vantage point, that's a completely false reading of what the rules said and what we should have been doing. I don't want anybody to be angry with junior officials or political advisors. I'm the Prime Minister. The buck stops with me. I'm apologising for it. And if you want to be angry with anyone, be angry with me. And I think if he'd done that, he probably would have got away with it. People would have been very angry, and he'd have had a period of real difficulty. But actually what drove people absolutely nuts was just months of lying and just continually lying about it. And that's what I think is so infuriating, that you can't, the only thing you can do when you've done something wrong, and the evidence is clear that you've done something wrong, is own up about it and ask people's forgiveness for it.
So I suppose before I hand over to the audience, after all of this, and we do have a different Prime Minister in post, and I'm sure you've got thoughts on him, Gavin. But do you think perhaps what your party needs is a period in opposition?
So I'm always nervous about answering. I've been asked that question, as you can imagine, a few times. I'm always nervous about answering yes, because I can remember back in 1997, people said we could do with 4 years in opposition, and it turned into 13. So political parties never like that. But the Conservative Party has to work out what it's for. It's confused, I think. Its kind of electoral base has changed over these different elections, and it doesn't have a coherent story at the moment to tell about who it's for. Now, maybe Rishi Sunak can do that in government. You can kind of renew yourself in government, but it definitely needs to sort itself out. Whether that's in opposition or under Sunak in government, that will be your judgment in a year and a half's time.
Gavin, thank you so much for telling us about your time in office, your time serving Theresa May. There's lots more that I think the audience would probably like to ask you, and it would be amazing at this point if I could see the audience.
There we go.
Fantastic. So we've got roving mics, so it'd be great to hear from students as well as adults in the audience. I can see we've got our first question over here, which is going to get a mic to you. Thanks, May.
That's very interesting what you had to say, and there's a lot to think about. But one of the things which you mentioned about Theresa May and what she was good at, and I guess sort of describing it this way, that she didn't feel like she could be authentic at the 2017 election. And you made the comparison with Blair and Cameron, that they're able to sell themselves even if they don't believe it. What you're describing, I think, and this is a terrible generalisation, but I would say that it is a classic male compared to female behaviour, and I sort of see it a lot in my profession, where women cannot sell themselves as much as men. They sort of, they'll say, oh, I can do this to this level, whereas men will always, again, generalisation, will always oversell what they're capable of. So the question for you is, do you think that there should be more women in politics? Because if there are more women in politics, then maybe people will feel that, being authentic is actually something you can do.
Yeah. So I definitely think we should have more women in politics. We've made some quite good progress on that during the course of my time involved in politics, but we're still not where we should be. I wouldn't limit it just to women. I think that actually what you want is you want the House of Commons to reflect the country that it serves. So that's also about ethnic diversity. It's also about geographic diversity, not having the vast majority of MPs coming from London and the South East. And it's also about class. Actually, if I compared the House of Commons today to when I first knew it in the early 1990s, we've seen real progress in female and ethnic minority representation. We've probably gone backwards on class. Fewer working class people in Parliament, I suspect. So I think that's really, that kind of diversity in all senses of the word is really important. But to your specific point on gender, probably one of the most interesting lessons for me in doing the job as a man, working for a female boss, was to see the way that she was treated differently by the media and by many of her colleagues, and the clear sexism that she faced.
Could you say a little bit more about that?
So I'll tell it, it's a funny story, but it illustrates a serious point. So there's only one time when I properly lost my temper with her, which was right at the end, when she announced that she was going to stand down. And some of you may remember it. She got a bit. She gave a statement outside Number 10, and she got a bit teary. And when she came back into Downing Street, I used to go out and watch her from sort of the side, and she was waiting for me outside the cabinet room, and she immediately apologised for getting emotional. And obviously, I was having a bad day generally. It wasn't very cheery. But I'd totally lost my temper. And so I said, I've been telling you for 2 years to show more of who you are. And it's ridiculous to apologise for being upset about the fact that you're having to stand down. Like, anyone watching the news tonight, seeing that, is not going to think there's anything weird or wrong with you being upset. And she let me kind of, the language was a bit more colourful than that, but she let me sort of rant on for a bit until I got it out of my system. And then she said, you wait, the papers will use those photos differently for me than they would have done if that was David Cameron or Gordon Brown. And she was right.
Where shall we go next? I can see, yes, I can see a question over there, I think near the back.
So you sort of covered this earlier, but what would you say is, since you've had a lot of interactions with politicians, what would you say is what you would think is the most important quality for a Prime Minister or a politician to have to properly do their job?
It's a tough question, because there's obviously lots of qualities that we have a right to expect in the people that are governing us. But I would say the most important quality is authenticity. I don't mean to be rude to all of you, but in my experience, voters, if I made you all do an exam on the detailed policies of the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat parties, I suspect a number of you wouldn't do that well. But voters are very, very good at judging which politicians are authentic and which are not. And so I think that's the key quality. Are you actually standing up for what you believe in and what you mean?
Yes, if I don't use anyone's names, it's because I can't quite see you, but let's go over here.
Hello. I was reading in the paper this morning about Boris Johnson recommending another 100+ people in his honours list. Just interested whether you think it's appropriate that public servants possibly get honours on resignation. I don't think of an equivalent in the private sector. I'm not sure it's sustainable.
So it's a difficult question for me to answer, isn't it? Because I was introduced as Lord Barwell, and the reason I'm Lord Barwell is because Theresa May made me appear when she resigned, because she was grateful for the support I'd given her. Do I think that should happen? Very rarely I think it's acceptable. I think Prime Ministers dishing out 100 honours, not acceptable. But it's obviously a difficult question for me to answer, given that I've been a recipient of it. Generally speaking, I think it's right that excellence in public service is recognised in some way. If it just becomes handing something out to all the people who've worked for you, it devalues the whole thing, doesn't it? And maybe there should be some kind of independent process that checks that the people that a Prime Minister has recommended are suitable for the honour.
Anybody else? Yes. Well, we might just get you the mic so that everyone can.
One of the early criticisms I heard of Theresa May, right at the beginning of her tenure, was that she was promising everything to everybody, particularly on both sides of the Brexit argument, and that we would have all the benefits. The people who believe we'd have all the benefits of the EU without being in it were not being told you need to make some compromises. And given the benefit of hindsight, do you think there are things she could have done differently, or was it an intractable problem that no one could have solved?
I have a little bit of sympathy with that critique. I suspect she privately would too, but with a caveat. What people tend to focus on is the party conference speech she gave in the autumn of 2016, which was her first big speech, where some people feel she went kind of too far in painting to the Eurosceptics what they might get. Now, even in that speech, she said we're going to have to make compromises. We're not going to get exactly what we want. So it's not that it was wholly wrong. But I think you have to have a little bit of understanding the situation she was in. It was a very weird inheritance, because if you remember the 2016 leadership election, First of all, Michael Gove imploded Boris Johnson. Then Michael Gove withdrew himself. Then Andrea Leadsom imploded herself. So Theresa became leader without beating anyone. Rishi has a bit of the same problem now. And in politics, authority comes from victory, whether it's victory in a general election or victory in an internal party leadership. If she had won and beaten a Brexiteer in the party leadership election, she would have felt much more relaxed about just saying, okay, that's what I said in the leadership election, that's what we're going to do. Whereas because she hadn't beaten anyone, she felt she had to kind of reassure that wing of the party that although she was a Remainer, she understood where they were coming from. So I think it's a fair critique, but you have to understand a bit the context that she was in that situation.
I can see quite a few different questions. I think we'll go sort of towards the back, right in the middle. Is it you, Molly? Yes, I can just about see you.
I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about how Boris Johnson should have dealt with Partygate. And I was wondering, do you think it would be acceptable for a Prime Minister to continue in office after violating law in time of crisis if he sincerely apologises? Or is it that we should hold politicians to a standard at which apologies just don't cut it?
So I think that's not a question for me. I'm not going to try and duck out of it, but I don't think it's a question for me to answer. I think it's a question for all of you. I think if a politician apologises and voters judge that they are genuinely contrite, then there may be circumstances in which they would forgive something. And if they don't forgive something, it'll be obvious in the polls that the position is untenable and then they have to resign. So I think it's perfectly reasonable for a politician, if they've done something wrong and they apologise and they mean it, to try and carry on. But the ultimate test of whether they can or not is whether the public are willing to accept that apology. And I suspect that will depend both on the severity of the offence and the extent to which people feel the apology was genuine. I mean, if I give you an example from when I was a government whip briefly. We were talking to some of the politics students about it beforehand. And I always used to say to MPs, quite often an MP will do something where they break some of the House of Commons rules and they have to apologise to the House of Commons. And I used to always, as a whip, you would sit on the front bench and you would listen to, or you would be in the House of Commons virtually the whole day listening to everything. And when MPs thought the apology was genuine, they would often say to someone, I'll sit down. I mean, there's one, I can remember one MP, and she started crying when she was reading out her apology. And the Labour MPs all just said, oh, sit down. We can tell you mean it. It's fine. Don't worry. And then other MPs read out a statement someone's given them, and every ounce of their body language says, I don't really mean what I'm saying. And then the House of Commons gets really angry. So I think people, as I said, people are good at judging authenticity, and they know when an apology is real or not. I think that if you've done something really seriously wrong, an apology is probably not going to get you off. But if it's not too serious an offence, I think contrition takes you a long way.
I think I'll go over here next, and then we'll go right to the back.
So I work in healthcare, and it's pretty challenging at the moment. I wonder whether you think there's a way of depoliticising the NHS.
Yeah, I think there is a potential opportunity. So politicians can do that on some issues. We've kind of depoliticised climate change in a way that they haven't in the US. You know, in the US, the Republicans are increasingly sceptical about quite a lot of the net zero agenda and ESG. Whereas in the UK, we basically have cross-party agreement around net zero by 2050. So I think it is possible. It's not easy because our system is adversarial. So the sort of default setting is for confrontation. It's the opposition's job to challenge the government. Now, I think the reality of the health service, we need a long-term plan to get the service back into the state that we as the voters have a right to expect, and also to make it a tolerable place to work. You know, given the pressure that there were some shocking figures I read this morning about the number of A&E staff who've effectively got PTSD symptoms after what they've been through over the last couple of years. So we owe it both to the people that work for the service and the people that use it and depend upon it to improve it. It's going to require a long-term plan about workforce, I think probably also about public health and reform of social care. And those things are only going to stick if you can get a degree of cross-party agreement on them. So it's definitely worth trying.
So Theresa May tried to reform social care, didn't she, in her 2017 manifesto?
Didn't go well.
And it didn't go very well. Do you think she should have stuck to her guns? Was she too frightened of losing the grey vote?
I think the public had reacted so viscerally against it, it was impossible to carry on. But the mistake was she kind of sprung the plan on people out of nowhere in an election manifesto. If you're trying to, the NHS is something people care very deeply about. If you're going to make changes to it, you've got to take people with you. And to do that, you first of all got to establish the argument, this is what's wrong, and then try and develop some consensus around solutions. I mean, if we come off social care for a second, the thing, I don't know whether you would agree with this, but the thing that I feel very strongly about healthcare is that what we actually have in this country is a national illness service that treats us when we get sick. And what we actually need is a national health service. So that, to me, the problem we've got, particularly for the students in the room, the population is ageing, so the service is going to get increased every year. We're going to have more elderly people with more complicated conditions that the service is going to have to try and provide for. So demand is rising all the time. So you've got to find ways of getting people to drink less, smoke less, eat better, exercise more, live in healthier homes, deal with air quality in our cities, so that you reduce demand and take some of the pressure off the people that work in the service.
I might come back to that thought in just a moment, but I'm going to go to the back. Yes.
Hi there. You talked briefly about the counterfactual of being Boris Johnson's Chief of Staff. Would you like to comment perhaps on the counterfactual of being Liz Truss's Chief of Staff?
Great. I was hoping somebody would bring up Liz Truss.
What to say? So maybe, I don't know, maybe that's an easier fix. I mean, I think that the problem that you had there was you got a whole group of people who were true believers, and nobody said, hang on a second, what about? And there's a painful lesson for us as a country, I think, that 49 days or however long it was teaches us, which is in this country, we don't have a written constitution. We have a whole series of informal rules and conventions that kind of govern how we work. And what she demonstrated was that those conventions are weak and can be easily overridden by someone who's determined to do it. So to give you two examples, there was the person who was the most senior civil servant at the Treasury. She probably knew that person would have refused to, or would have required what's called a ministerial direction to do that mini budget. So she fired him. And then obviously the person you bring in on probation is much less likely to cause you a problem. And then we've always relied on, in recent years, on the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility producing the numbers that tell us what the fiscal impact of the government's policies are. And she just said, well, I'm not going to publish one of those. And actually the real story that the media haven't really properly told is that the third check and balance worked, which is the Bank of England. Because the Bank of England basically brought Liz Truss down. The bank governor initially intervened to stop the chaos in the markets and then said, as of this date, we're going to stop. And at that point, the Treasury civil servants basically said to Truss, if you don't U-turn on your policies, all hell is going to break loose on that date when the Bank of England stops doing it. So, whether if you'd had a chief of staff who had actually said, this is nuts, she would have listened to it, I don't know. I mean, to me, there's a whole load of economic arguments about whether or not you should be cutting taxes when you've already got high inflation because you're just going to fuel that inflation, or whether you should be adding to borrowing when borrowing is already really high. But beyond the economic arguments about that, I have a simple moral objection to what she did, which is at a time when millions of people in this country are struggling to pay for their heating and put food on the table, cutting taxes for people like me is obscene and betrays a total absence of political judgment. And I say that as someone who, long term, would quite like to see tax rates come down. I buy her argument that lower taxes are good and create incentives to work, but politics is about timing, and it's so tin-eared to try and do that in the middle of a cost of living crisis when there are loads of other people who more deserve the help. And I actually watched that mini-budget with a bunch of PwC partners, all of whom would have benefited from that policy, and they were visibly angry and uncomfortable that someone would think that to give them more money in that moment, which is wrong.
Yeah. We might come back to, to Liz Truss in a moment, but I'm going to go to the middle of the room, and then I'm going to go, sorry, I can't see. I know it's one of our students, but I can't see in the dark.
How do you think your experience in the House of Lords has been different from the House of Commons? And do you think that the House of Lords is in like urgent need of reform?
So I haven't spent a huge amount of time there. If I'm honest, I've got a business that I've set up, and I spend most of my time doing that. But the Lords has got some incredibly experienced people there who make an important contribution to public life and debate. But it's not as vibrant as the Commons. You don't have the same interaction and debate as you get in the Commons. I think your question was, is it in urgent need of reform? So I think it is in need of reform. I wouldn't, if you made me Prime Minister tomorrow, it wouldn't be one of the first things I did. I think there are other questions that I would turn to first. But longer term, my view is that most of the people in the House of Lords should be elected by you. I would probably still have a small appointed section, but through an independent process, coming back to the question the lady over there asked. So I think there is a merit in having some faith leaders and senior scientists maybe and people like that in there who would not want to run for election on a political ticket, but people that are there to be politicians should be chosen by the public.
You said that you debated a lot at university, and I'd imagine that a lot of people in Parliament have similar backgrounds. I was wondering if you think debating actually makes people better politicians, or does it make them harder to read because they're so used to smoothly switching between two sides of an argument, particularly as you keep talking about the importance of authenticity when it comes to public buy-in?
It's a good question. I think there's a bit of truth in both, if I'm honest. So if what you get out of debating is the ability to listen to other people's arguments and judge where they've got a valid point or where they've not, that I think is a very useful skill for a politician. Coming back to the first lady's question about men and women in politics and how they behave, when I ran for re-election in 2015, and when I ran for election first time in 2010, my Labour opponent was a man of about my age. And when I ran for re-election, Labour selected a female candidate. And we had about 15 or 20 hustings meetings like this during the campaign. And the first one, I asked a couple of my friends to come along and just watch at the back and tell me how they thought I did. And when I came out, I said, "How do you think that went?" And they said, "Well, do you want the good news or the bad news?" And I was like, "Well, the whole thing." And they said, "Well, you definitely won the debate, but I would never vote for you based on that. You basically looked like you were just mansplaining to her the whole way through the debate. You clearly knew more about it, but you just came across as a really arrogant expletive." So that's the bad side of debating, right? If debating is just about point scoring and trying to show how clever you are, then that's not a very good characteristic in a politician. So I think it's a good question, and there's good and bad in it, I would say.
Can I have a sense of how many more questions we've got in the audience? So I think we'll have a question from here, and I think there was one towards the back of the room as well. Do you want to raise your hands again so I can see you if you've got a question to ask? Yes, so we'll take those two, and then I might have one final one to end on. One thing I should mention, if you're sort of thinking of your final questions, is Gavin now spends his time advising multinational companies on security risk. So it might be interesting to have a question perhaps on the sort of future of politics and some of the threats that our world faces. But go for it.
What's your stance on how the government is handling the Ukrainian war? And do you think this should be something that the government should or should not be doing?
So broadly speaking, I think Johnson, Truss and Sunak have all done well on this. So should we be helping Ukraine? Definitely. It's very easy to say, well, this is just somewhere quite a way away and it's none of our business, but history teaches us very clearly the dangers of allowing people to behave in the way that Putin has behaved. There's no grey area here. He has invaded another sovereign country and he's trying to use force to impose his will on other people. And it's right that we both try and punish him economically for what he's done, but also try and, they want to fight for their freedom, and we should be doing everything we can to equip them and help them to do that. We've got some really difficult questions that await us it's possible that we end up in a world where the war stops in a kind of inconclusive way. You might get just a sort of ceasefire or freeze in the fighting, but without a proper peace treaty. And we're going to have to make some really difficult decisions about what guarantees we're prepared to give Ukraine in that situation in terms of its long-term security, and what obligations we're prepared to accept in that scenario. But I guess there were probably two things, and I might come on to the last one at the end, but there were two things that I wanted to say to the younger people in the room, which is that unfortunately the world that you're growing up in is an increasingly complicated and insecure one. And so one of the real challenges for our politicians, they tend to get elected to focus on the health service and the economy and education and those things, but they have to devote a significant chunk of your time, if you're Prime Minister, to the world that we live in and trying to find ways of building stability there. Because my generation has lived through this unprecedented period where we haven't been called to go and fight for our country in the way that my parents and my generation and my grandparents' generation were required to do, and we don't want to go back to that kind of world. So how we respond to these kinds of aggressions is really important.
We go to the question we had at the back of the room. Yeah.
Really interesting observations from you. I had a question to you. How optimistic or pessimistic are you about the role of Britain in the world today? Given your experience, in the cockpit of government and now in business advising multinational corporations, is this just a passing phase where there's a lot of inward focus on genuine matters, and Britain will have a leading role to play in world affairs, or is there a trajectory which we should be concerned about?
I'm a reasonable optimist. I think that we shouldn't go over the top, right? So you get some people who try and one of the things I used to hate was this phrase "special relationship with the US," as if we were somehow uniquely important to America in a way that their relations with Germany or France or Canada or China are not, right? So sometimes we kind of get a bit full of ourselves and try and pretend we're more important than we are. But I think there are lots of ways in which the UK can still make a very positive contribution globally. One of the things that we should treasure is our university system, which gives us huge soft power. We've probably still got the second best university system in the world. Very large numbers of future world leaders come here and are educated here and get to know this country, and that is of huge value to us. And I think you can also think certain sort of sectors of the economy where the UK has a sort of leading role to play. And also our history and our interconnectedness means we have relations, sometimes complicated, with a lot of historical baggage, but we have connections to lots of places in the world that does give us the ability to act on a kind of global stage. So we shouldn't be too down. We've gone through this incredibly turbulent, some would say embarrassing period in our politics. We shouldn't be too down on ourselves. There are still lots of good things about this country that mean it's well positioned going forward, and we need to be realistic about where we stand in the world and what those opportunities are, and we need to have a clear strategy about how to maximise them. But overall, hopefully that feels a bit more optimistic than pessimistic.
Gavin, I actually wanted to end on, I suppose, a question about the future. As you know from your field of work, and as you've mentioned, we're facing some very, very significant challenges, and it does feel as if we keep on saying, this is a period of unprecedented uncertainty and turbulence, and then along comes yet another period of uncertainty and turbulence. Are you hopeful for the future of politics, and to what extent are you hopeful about the future of politics, and what gives you hope?
I'm more pessimistic about the future of politics, not just in this country, but generally. So if some of you in the room are labouring under the impression that politicians are not as good as they used to be, I think it's both probably partially true, in that for the reasons we were talking about earlier, it's become harder to attract good people in, but it is also harder to be the Prime Minister today than it used to be. And the reason for that is this is the point you actually queued me up to the last thing I wanted to say. The reason for that is the combination of social media and AI. So I talked about social media a little bit earlier. Increasingly, we live in a society where people live in these little bubbles, talking to people whose views they find acceptable. We don't have the kind of national conversation that we used to have when everybody heard the news from a couple of TV stations and a few newspapers. And then AI allows hostile countries to inject virtually limitless amounts of disinformation into those social media bubbles. So, I'm currently trying to parent 3 boys, 1 young man, 2 boys. And because of what I do as a job, you won't be surprised to know we talk quite often over the family dinner table about what's going on in the world. And it's really shocking to see how much of what they're exposed to in their networks is just not true. So it's become almost a kind of joke at our table now that one of them will raise something and I'll say, who told you that? Where does that come from? Because it doesn't sound right to me. You need to go away and check. Can you find some independent authentication that that's true? And they've now got quite savvy at doing that. And what's interesting is their reaction to it is a little bit different to mine. So they now have got a better sense of what are the reliable sources of information. But they're sometimes still mildly entertained by the false stuff in a way that I'm annoyed by it. But I think if you're a young person growing up today and you're interested in politics or what's going on in the world, it's so much harder than it was when I was growing up because you're exposed to so much disinformation. And sifting through that and making good judgments about what's true and what's not is much more difficult. And I think we've got some really difficult questions to ask ourselves about how we kind of manage that process. And then coupled to that, we've also got this kind of populism in our politics. And obviously maybe some people here will agree with it, but personally, given that I am fairly centrist, as you've probably got a sense tonight, I worry a lot about that. Somebody asked me a question earlier about what's the most important quality in a politician, and I said authenticity. I'd like to come back and change my answer, having thought about it a little bit more. I would say you could divide politicians into 2 tribes, but it's not a red tribe and a blue tribe. It's those politicians who are trying to find ways to bring people together and find common answers to a problem, and the people who are deliberately trying to draw a dividing line in order to have slightly more on their side of the dividing line to win an election. And it's not a happy future if we proceed with politics on that basis.
I've got one suggestion, which might be some more women. I think it sounds as if education has got an awful lot of responsibility to assume here in terms of preparing young people for the future political world they're going to face. Gavin, thank you so much for your incredible insights. It's been a real privilege to hear from someone who's been right at the heart of politics and has done several different really important roles in politics and is now have this amazing perspective on both recent British political history but also what the future may hold for us. And I think Charlotte is going to come and say a few words more eloquently than me to say thank you.
Hi everyone, and thank you Lord Barwell for such an insightful talk today. I think there were a couple things that struck me most when listening to you. I think number one, as a fellow debater, and I think I echo Olivia's question when I say this, the importance of listening and how that is the way that you get progress. I think we are all guilty of just shouting our opinion at others, but that by listening to others and to those we disagree with, that's how we end up in the camp of politicians who try and bring people together rather than divide them, and how important that is. I think I also really admired your ability to take bold risks, telling Theresa May what you disliked about her decisions, because that was what was needed to build that relationship and then achieve your job to the best of your ability. And I think that's something, that kind of courage is something that we can all kind of take forward, particularly as I'm at least going out into the world and entering adult life. And I think the final thing is the importance of standing up for what you believe in. I think you displayed this with Lillian's law, not only helping a family, but changing the actual law and impacting hundreds of people in the future. But I think also in your description of Theresa May, that whether or not you agreed with her politics, she truly tried to do what she thought was right. And I think I really value the kind of honesty behind that. And I think that's incredibly important, particularly, as you say, the kind of environment of politics that we're in right now. So thank you everyone for providing such a fantastic audience and for your probing questions. And can I ask you all to have a round of applause for Lord Barwell?
you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to Lord Barwell for a fascinating evening, and I hope you'll join us for the final speaker series of the academic year and my own final speaker series in the summer term. But thank you so much for your brilliant questions, and thank you once again, Gavin, for an absolutely brilliant evening.